This panel is Jamf and compliance, and we're joined by some really interesting folks from the industry who have unique perspectives, which probably you all do too. So feel free to tell us all about it a little bit later on. But let me do a quick intro. We're joined by Luis Giraldo, who's the Vice President of Product at IT Glue. Miles Lacey, who's the tech expert of Apple Technologies at Walmart. Matt Woodruff, Senior Systems Engineer at Jamf. Kane Hur, he's the Senior IT Security Engineer at Okta. And also Andrew Nielsen, who's the Chief Trust Officer at Druva. Thank you all for coming. We're going to start off with just a little bit of kind of framing the conversation from the industry perspectives that you all bring. And then we'll be a little bit more free-form. The mics are up here up front. Please feel free to come up and ask some questions. The kind of starter that I wanted to think about was, we have said the word compliance here at JNUC in probably 20 different contexts in the past couple days, and it means a little bit something different to pretty much everybody. So I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about what it means to your organization, and yeah, we're just going to start with that. So Luis, you're up first.
Thanks, Katie. Well, thanks everybody for being here. For us in IT Glue, we're recently a Jamf shop. I've been an integrator for a few years, but we were previously on a different product. And for us, compliance comes around a few different requirements. Specifically, we are a SOC 2 compliant organization, so one of the things that we need to be able to do when audited, for example, is be able to prove that certain controls are in place for password security, password strength requirements, screensaver, timeouts, that kind of stuff. And so the ability to show how these configuration profiles have in fact been deployed by Jamf is one of the things that we go through in a typical audit. But on the other side of that is also the controls and documentation of that. And so it's ironic or perfect that we are a documentation platform, because we use our own platform to actually document the controls, the version history of all the processes and SOPs around that compliance and that auditing processes, in order to be able to show the auditors when changes have been made, who approved the changes. And this is one of the challenges that a lot of the customers that we work with as a software platform have in their own environments. And so it's why they come to us in some cases to use IT Glue for documentation as well.
So speaking about compliance, oftentimes you'll find that compliance typically means different things to different organizations, and certainly in different contexts. So you've got certain things that you can't get away from, where they might be a legal requirement. Depending on how broadly spread your org is, you may have many different legal requirements for different countries, different states, what have you. And then depending on what sort of work your organization does, of course, you've got medical compliance, you've got financial compliance, and so on and so on. And then with all the various acronyms those come with, as well as your own internal policy compliance. But one thing that I find is true in most of those cases is compliance is really about deciding what your state's going to be and being able to report against it. Very few standards dictate a particular action or setting. Some do, but for the most part, you're required to know what your state is and be able to report back on that. So that's where something like Jamf is excellent, where a lot of those reporting points are built in, and if they're not, you can build yourself an extension attribute to build reports against.
Thank you, Maz. So one of the perspectives I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of is the reason possibly why I am up here. I am not necessarily representing Jamf, and in regards to how we implement or apply compliance within the organization of Jamf, I'm up here more because I actually cover the federal government space and a lot of our regulated industries. So I've gotten to the point of understanding a lot of what our federal government customers do in regards to applying FISMA standards, as well as any of the CIS or the DISA-STIG standards across a security baseline, and what are those possibilities that exist, because those security baselines are not affecting not just our government space they also are regulated industries. So if you're identified as PHI, PCI, or any of those other industries, you might have some questions about what is possible, what can Jamf do, and what have possibly I seen. So everything is going to be wrapped around this compliance discussion, and hopefully I can help guide some of those topics as you guys hopefully ask some great questions. So thank you.
So working for Okta has been very interesting. Been finding that we're a publicly traded company, so we are SaaS and SOX compliant. This is public knowledge. We're also FedRAMP compliant, so that falls into a very interesting category dealing with the federal government. And so there's various controls and remediation practices that we must adhere to. I jotted down a few notes. I wanted to kind of get a definition of what compliance was according to Merriam-Webster. It's the act or process of complying to a desired demand, proposal, or regimen. And one of the things that it had as a sidebar is the ability of an object to yield elastically when a force is applied, also known as flexibility. And I think that concept of elastically and flexibility is key when we're dealing with compliance. David Page of Security Metrics states organizations must address all known security vulnerabilities and be consistent with industry accepted standards. Such standards might include CIS, ISO, PCI, SANS, NIST, and those kind of things play a key role in how your organization will adhere to compliancy. And when discussing those technical compliance and controls, we must recognize the differences between system hardening and patching. System hardening processes establish a baseline foundation of system functionality and security, and it's through the act of proactively updating and patching that a required level of security can be maintained. That being said, each organization must determine for themselves what level of security controls are necessary for their particular system and business needs. By adopting and adhering to those aforementioned security controls, you can effectively reduce your security vulnerability footprint. And when properly configured, tools such as Jamf Pro provide the means of compliance adhesion and remediation. And organizations can gather their metrics through various means to determine their overall security compliancy report card, as it will. Jamf is one such tool that Okta uses, as do you. And it can provide insight into your organization's overall security compliancy footprint. It's through the use of Jamf policy scripts, extension attributes, like Miles suggested, and other third-party tools that an organization can identify, report, and remediate accordingly. And I think that's key for everyone to understand how that plays into the compliancy role.
Cool. So being from Druva, I work more in the certifications and compliance space. I'm not necessarily a Jamf practitioner, but we do use it internally for a lot of our telemetry data about meeting our own internal controls. But being a SaaS provider, we are measured on what's audits and attestations we have, like SOC 2. We just completed FedRAMP. We're in the middle of GDPR audits, and it's really about providing that trust with our customers that their data is going to be safe with us. And when you deal with compliance, I mean, I've yet to meet an auditor that actually enforces the same rule the same way across audit firms. So it's a little bit about what you negotiate, but tools like Jamf and solid reporting really give you the insight and the visibility that you need to meet those requirements.
Go ahead and hang on to the mic. I'll give folks a minute to get up to the microphones for questions if you like. One of the questions I have, and this actually comes directly from a customer, he's an admin who finds himself kind of stuck in the middle of InfoSec direction that kind of puts him at odds with his end users. So InfoSec says, I need you to lock down computers in this way. Users say, that's awful. So what kind of tools might you think of or recommendations would you offer to an admin who's kind of stuck in that position? How do we empower our fellow admins to be able to make good decisions on behalf of the user? And what might those recommendations look like from your own perspectives? Feel free to pass the mic around.
Yeah, sure. For us, it's interesting because a lot of it happens through tribal assistance, if you will. For example, people can't walk away from their desks without locking their screen. And the first time somebody is having to do that, it takes a few slaps on the wrist and several people around them, taking their computer, hiding it, stuff like that, to make sure that they get used to the idea that they always have to ensure their computer is locked before they walk away from their desks. But what's interesting about this sort of communication part is that Mac admins aren't often used to the fact that they're the ones who will end up communicating these things to the end users. But also InfoSec doesn't necessarily explain why these controls is necessary to the admins in some organizations. In my case, I'm part of the security committee, so I understand why all the requirements are in place, and we get to communicate this, and we're a smaller company of about 100 people, so it doesn't take that much effort to get the message out to everybody of why these things are required. So I'd say the communication piece is critical to getting users to understand why certain things are required, why the compliance is important for the organization, and how that's going to help security overall.
Yeah, so I would echo a lot of that. And the scenario, as Katie put it, is, to me, more of a social issue than a technology issue. So you need to have that open communication with your security teams, with your users. Ideally, your security teams are communicating their intent and how they're going about solving that intent with users. A lot of times they won't, right? I've seen a lot of organizations where that happens. And it falls on you as the scenario was laid out. But then, to me, that's where you want to make friends, right? Bring donuts and beer to your security people. Learn what's going on and why, so that if they're not going to communicate it, you can.
Exactly. Communication is paramount to a successful program. One of the things that we do at Okta as well, part of our FedRAMP compliancy, is we kind of think backwards about our control set. We kind of build our FedRAMP compliancy based on what we currently have, and then we remediate going forward. And so we can identify key groups of users at different times that may have different needs or requirements. And so we can loosen the restrictions for a specific group at a specific time for whatever reason we need, and still maintain our FedRAMP compliancy. So to give a broad example, for example, maybe your company uses two-factor authentication, and maybe you're adhering to CIS policies for password restrictions across the board. That may be great for your security teams and your DevOps teams and any other engineering teams that are dealing with highly sensitive data. But perhaps your sales and marketing guys are frustrated by 15-character passwords with obscene complexity. So you reduce the restrictions down, you violate CIS, but you have two-factor, and that's part of your FedRAMP auditing guidelines, and therefore your company stays on par with your requirements. And that way you can kind of help certain communities within your organization feel a little more accommodated.
Yeah, I think for us it comes down to two things. It's really transparency and education. And you can never educate your users enough. I don't care how many security training classes you have. I don't care how many usability classes you have. You can never beat that drum enough and explain to them why you're doing what you're doing around compliance. Yeah, I think the other piece around that we deal with, especially being a startup that has just finished FedRAMP, is really isolating the environments that you're in and keeping it as transparent as possible. I mean, we've been a Jamf company for over a year. I've never even looked at the client. I don't know it's there. All I know is I get my patches, my computer runs great, and I'm happy. And that's the best thing you can do. So the more transparent you can make it, the better off you are.
You have a question?
Hey, Charles.
So compliance for us involves not just auditing, but also communicating non-compliance. So if a system's starting to violate or getting close to violating a compliance state, that we're communicating that out. So if it hasn't checked in so long or something like that. So what are you doing? What tools do you have or workflows do you perhaps recommend to communicating that out to the end user, to management? Because those are two different challenges and two different styles of communication that you need to have.
Two-part answer. One is we do have incident trackers. So whenever there's a non-compliance that is part of something that we know is going to be asked of us in an audit, for example, we do keep track of it. There are also things we call opportunities for improvement, where there's smaller non-compliances but not critical to the audit, nothing that's going to sort of fail us in an audit, but still something we'd like to make better if there's an opportunity. But there's also the opportunity to declare something as a risk that you're willing to accept. And in many compliance programs, there is such a thing where, you identify that there's a risk or a non-compliance, and it's something that the organization can choose to accept as a risk that they take, and that's just it. So in some cases, we have vendors that we work with that may not be SOC 2 compliant, and so we can choose to accept that risk or not work with them. And in some cases, we don't have a choice but to work with that particular vendor. And so we choose to accept that risk, and it's something that has to be logged, documented, approved, signed by the CSO, that kind of stuff. So those are the two vectors in our case.
I mean, for us, I'll give you an example. We have a vendor management program where we rank everything. It's green, yellow, red. And the severity takes a higher level of signature. And, when we communicate to our board, we communicate in terms of money and financial risk, and we communicate to our end users. We use it as a teaching moment and saying, hey, this is why we're doing this. We're not picking on you. We're not trying to frustrate you in your work. It's just this is what needs to be done in order for us to stay in the business that we're in. And that's really how we do it.
We actually leverage communication between key departments, specifically our support department in IT, our IT engineering departments, our security departments, and we work very closely together with our compliance and legal teams, and that takes care of the communication aspect. So security will present vulnerabilities, and we will go in and we'll look at those and try to remediate, and depending on the severity of that vulnerability, we'll communicate with various heads of state, so to speak, and have that communicated out to the community. And if necessary, we'll talk to specific individuals as needed. And of course, the tool set you mentioned. We use Jamf, of course, but we also use other vendor-provided tools that come with the various platforms that we use, network monitoring, different discovery tools that the security team and tech ops teams use. A lot of our network vendors provide in-house tools in their kits, and those are very helpful in identifying breaches of security and compliancy. And Jamf is really good with its notifications, so long as people use them. And of course, that's a matter of compliancy within your IT structure as well, and training your team how to use those tools.
Thanks.
When it comes to patching, how do you balance being on the newest, most secure versus being on a stable, known, working? How do you make that balance? Because sometimes those updates will break things, but it is important to be on the newest patch. How do you balance that?
I know one of the pieces that I've started seeing is the new CDM initiative within the government is forcing down 72-hour response time for patching of software. And so it's the identification that you've got a workflow that exists for any software programs that are critical, that have data that also cannot obviously leave the org. And in that case, as soon as a patch does exist, you've got an expedited chance of testing that and using something like Jamf Pro to automate the deployment of something like that. And then you also update any type of inventory data points. That includes sending that data out to Splunk so that all integration points that have to touch that data and acknowledge it and keep it in an audit log is going to be valid within the time frame given. So I believe that's something for each org to set up. What is that policy for your org, and how are you going to apply that policy?
I guess to get more specific, let's say a point update comes out for Mac OS. Is that something you just jump on right away? Do you pilot that? Do you wait a week, see if anything pops up, that kind of thing?
So for Mac OS, we have the great benefit, and as administrators, we ought to be taking advantage of the beta programs. And generally speaking, a macOS update includes security content, and you're going to be furthering your compliance by getting that out as quickly as possible, if not as soon as it's available. So that's sort of the advice there. In any organization I work with or talk with, I always try to go, 0-day release on the macOS stuff. For other vendors, it may vary depending on how much we trust them and what their track record looks like. But certainly for the OS, I would recommend always be up to date. But also always participate in that beta, because you want to make sure you're not introducing anything new. You want to make sure that your third-party vendors are compliant with the new update. And that's an important distinction to make, right? A lot of folks will look at it and say, oh, Apple broke Microsoft. It's the wrong way of looking at it. Microsoft violated Apple's rules, right? So not to pick on Microsoft, a lot of vendors do that. Microsoft doesn't do it so much in the past few years.
They're friends now.
Yeah.
That actually brings up another good point. Putting on like my Apple cap of being a former Apple engineer is the identification that you also sift through the third-party providers that you are working with to identify, are they also in Apple's developer programs, so that they are getting the updates and testing their own stuff before deployment. Because you as the end user have the CVEs that you must patch with each OS update, because that vulnerability is greater at an OS level than possibly an app level. And so making sure that you get those out in an expedited case certainly will help you in the end.
These guys have covered everything pretty well, but I'm going to introduce a different topic for you. Something like a change review board within your organization is handy as well. That way you don't have cowboys. It goes through a structured process. You suggest to your change review board that you have something you would like to implement and deploy. And that will usually consist of some queries regarding what kind of effect this product will have on the enterprise as a whole, who's your target audience, what's your plan for remediation, how are you going to test it, and what kind of metrics are you going to get back after you're done. And obviously that doesn't take into account for zero-day patching, but if you have a proper change review board, you can also have a post-mortem. So if a zero-day comes out, you can deploy quickly, but then you go through the change review board process and explain why you took the actions that you did. And that can be very handy, especially when you're doing a little CYA.
So that actually introduces an interesting topic as far as the resources dedicated to things like patching and tracking compliance. And I've seen from customer perspectives kind of both ends of the spectrum, where it's just patch everything now because I don't have time to do anything else, or we have a very structured, regimented, carefully regulated patch review, user acceptance testing process, and that must be completed before anything else happens. And it depends on resource availability. And so that's one of those, the great IT answer, it depends, right? Thanks. Come on up.
I have the issue of InfoSec is you must do. You must use tools that some of us find not the best in terms of how well they work with the Mac. SEP, do we really need SEP? SEP not working with OS 10, High Sierra, since we're at 12. You must use bit 9, they're not really managing it. You must use, for one of the other sites, Mandiant. My goal for coming here, one of them is to look at a way of how we can sit down with InfoSec and maybe train them a little bit in what Apple's doing, and I'd like to be able to come with a structured means to say, hey guys, this sucks. These people have the point of view where they don't live at the speed of Apple, which has always been an issue. And what, we have Casper, Jamf Pro, we can use it to do what you want to do. But, they live in their little high container, InfoSec container. You must do, and of course, if the result is bad, it's our fault. If the result is good, it's their fault.
Again, I think that comes back to the social issue, where you want to develop a relationship with those teams so that you can help bring that education to them. And also, you want to become a trusted partner in their eyes, because what you really have to end up doing for a probably Windows-focused team, I'm guessing, that doesn't understand the Apple technology or the Apple ways of doing things, we need to get them to be open to that conversation. And instead of saying, deploy this product or you must set this setting, be open to hearing, well, that setting doesn't exist in Mac OS, or that product just doesn't work. What's your goal, and how can we achieve that? Does the OS do it for us? Is there another product we could use? But that's really about building that relationship so that you can have those conversations, so you could drill down to what's the true requirement as opposed to the one that they're giving you. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but our InfoSec, one of our divisions, has been fun.
Okay, yep.
The other InfoSecs don't particularly care for the one in my division.
Sure, and that's the social hurdle, which...
And it is social, and he's losing people rapidly, but he still has his power.
Mm-hmm.
One of the additional perspectives that I would put into this is, just as he stated, there's a relationship, hopefully, that can be grasped at some point. Once that relationship is built, it's the identification that the operating systems themselves and even network components work together in a certain way that they understand today. Apple's operating system is so drastically different. That's the reason why the Jamf Pro product exists. It's because SCCM doesn't do it well. So in that aspect, you might find that getting Apple to come in to announce why their operating system is different so that they can understand what management frameworks need to exist. So for example, the Apple Professional Services Group has something called the Apple Readiness Review. And what my suggestion would be is to get them to come in and announce from Apple's perspective, this is the reason why you would need to review something like this in your organization, because here's why our operating system is different and how it communicates to your network, how it communicates to firewalls differently. All of those pieces and components must be drawn out from Apple's perspective, and then you can get Jamf Pro to be able to handle those security baselines even better as the implementation goes through. Hopefully.
There's another way to tackle this as well, and this is part of the culture that Miles was talking about. And I think it's also a little bit of the negotiation that Andrew was talking about. One of the tactics I like to use when I'm confronted with similar issues, when I'm told no, and I'm not given a very good reason, I'll typically go out and research other products on my own, and then I will identify those key areas that security or compliancy is looking for, but I'll find those in a Mac-compatible product. And then I'll work with my supervisors and my administration team, and we'll put together a panel, and we'll set up a meeting, and we'll talk to them, and we'll address those issues one by one, and try to let them know that we understand what their needs are and what their goals and objectives are, and we're going to provide a suite of products that they can choose from that meet those demands. And that way we can build that relationship by showing that we're doing our due diligence. And just like, sorry, Matt. Just like Matt suggested, Apple Readiness Review is one thing. Also, having a Jamf come out and talk to the powers of Jamf and its capabilities, and also looking at other products. For example, the 3 products you mentioned, I'm not familiar with, but maybe you're familiar with other products that do the same thing. And if you can bring that to the table, you might have more negotiating power.
I'm interested in how you actually deploy the point updates. If you're going to deploy them quickly once you've verified them, how do you deal with the downtime for users while that's being done? Because it could take 30, 40 minutes depending what the point update is. Do you just set a cultural thing with users that this is what's going to happen? Do you push it out to them, or is it something you ask them to go and do through self-service or manually?
Go ahead. So I think from my perspective, of course, the best solution is a mixture of those. And Jamf helps provide that, and Apple also helps provide that. So Let's say, for example, we're expecting at some point in the relatively near future a 10.13.1 update, right? That's going to become available in the App Store unless we're doing something to prevent that, which I wouldn't recommend, right? If your folks want to go into the App Store and click that button and update early, awesome. But then we could use Jamf tools to enforce that, right? So we might discuss with our security and compliance stakeholders how many days do we have before we need to be patched. And so that would also call for clear communication to the user to say, hey, this patch is available. You can install it whenever you like. If you haven't installed it in 14 days, it's going to happen automatically. So,
is that the same for OS versions? So to go from Sierra to High Sierra, for example, do you do that similar sort of thing?
Ideally, I would say so, but even more so than what we were talking about earlier as far as the testing the betas, right? You want to make sure that the business critical software isn't going to run into issues. And again, ideally, during that beta period between developers conference and release, you're working with your third-party vendors to identify those ahead of time so that way they're eliminated. But I've never seen every piece of software eliminate those issues on a release cycle. So another good piece is maybe as a what's the new word in self-service bookmark? So maybe through a self-service bookmark, publish a web page that says, these are the apps we use that have been tested good, these are questionable, these don't work, right? And so then the user can make an informed decision as to when they're going to click that button.
Yeah. The thing for us is that Sierra is still a supported OS, and so we choose to have the cultural communication and conversation around, we don't need you to upgrade immediately. In fact, we probably don't want you to, because we want to do it in a controlled fashion once we know that the business stack of applications is going to be compatible and we're not going to have issues that produce just any more downtime. From a security perspective, as long as the OS is supported, we don't force users to upgrade. In fact, we kind of put a little bit of a block on High Sierra on day one. Yeah. We just didn't want that kind of interruption from a business perspective. But the other thing is also when patch releases do need to go out urgently, we are a security-first organization, and that's been sort of ingrained into the culture. People know that if there is a security-related request, that's going to take priority over, finishing whatever other thing that they had on their plate. So that's our specific communication style.
One last thing I want to kind of help us all understand what we are possibly seeing in the future of how Apple's OS update release cycle and management of OS release cycle is kind of heading, and that is because of the new key pairs that exist in configuration profiles for deferring OS updates for up to 90 days. And you get to handle that now, but as you continue to review what that capability is, you need to map that to what your future plans are going to be for what High Sierra plus the future looks like in your testing patterns. Obviously get into the beta program as we continue to strive to push you and everyone towards, and just keep that in mind as we are starting to see what High Sierra and the controls around that looks like from an MDM perspective.
Cool.
Great. Thank you.
We are all familiar with running antivirus in our environments, and often that's a checkbox on an audit, and I get that. We won't argue the value of our antivirus. But in the crop of new tools like DLP, SSL intercept, and proxies, what do you guys see in your environments? What do you have to deal with? And if you have good experiences, can you share those? Thanks.
Yeah, I would say we definitely see an uptick in SSL inspection. A lot more organizations are definitely trying to get a look inside that traffic in general. That does cause certain issues depending on how browsers and web servers want to respond to those type of requests, and that depending on what type of security infrastructure you have in the middle that's actually trying to do the traffic inspection sort of has its own issues. But definitely a lot around that. We also see a fair amount of migration away from your traditional AV vendors. to pick on one who's here, we see a lot of customers move to Sentinel-1, and sort of, I guess, what your next-gen providers anti-malware is doing. But to your point, yeah, AV is completely a compliance thing, and we have customers who we work with, and they're still running Norton or Symantec, whatever it is now, and it passes every time, even though it provides, well, we'll say its value is questionable. How's that?
So another thing I'll throw out there, and every non-Apple focused security person I've spoken to has initially been at least skeptical of this approach, but if you pair with your Apple reps, you may be able to get your security and compliance teams to accept the built-in tools in macOS as the antivirus solution. There's a lot in there, and your Apple engineers can speak to that to the security folks. And if that conversation goes well, answer all their questions, and XProtect, for example, and Gatekeeper, plus all the other pieces in there, could tick that box potentially.
To the comment about proxies, as an integrator, over the years we saw many situations where an organization requires every single device on the network to go through the proxy, and in some cases DEP, VPP are just not going to work properly in that scenario. And so it just, again, creates the situation of just needing a conversation and communication around, hey, what is the requirement? Is there some other way we can actually protect this machine that would allow you to let this machine communicate directly with the internet? That kind of stuff. In almost every single case, we were able to get an exception, and it just involved being able to document it, the reason why, and getting the necessary approval, and that let things move forward. But I think sometimes we take the hard no as a no wiggle room, but I tend to think there's always a little wiggle room. It's just a matter of documenting and understanding what the requirement is from the top down.
Just to bounce off of Miles' comment about XProtect, whether you're a shop that adheres to CIS compliancy or not, there are some CIS compliancy controls that revolve around XProtect and Gatekeeper. And you can take those examples in the CIS benchmarks, roll them into an extension attribute, and have Jamf report against it. That way, XProtect and Gatekeeper are no longer a black box to your security team.
All right. Sorry, I'm really tall. So as far as exporting information for auditors from Jamf, right, being able to say, hey, we're compliant, and demonstrating from Jamf, hasn't always been the easiest or smoothest process to make that happen. Do y'all have any best practices or something that you've been able to do you can share with us?
Bouncing off my previous comment, I typically give my security and compliancing team auditor controls within Jamf, and that way they can go in and look for themselves. And that involves a little bit of training, but that's part of that culture change and fostering goodwill between your departments.
Yeah, we do the same. Oftentimes, auditors just want to spot check. They don't necessarily need to audit every single piece. They'll just randomly spot check this computer, that computer, and want to see that the control is in place, how it's being reported on, or that we have a sort of a track record of how decisions are approved or changed, control, managed, et cetera. And so we haven't really had the issue of having to report on it on a larger scale, show us how every machine in your organization is compliant with this particular setting. And I don't think most auditors do that in most programs that I know of anyways. So I guess it just depends. The API also can get you a lot of information programmatically, and so those that aren't using the API, we're seeing a lot more people doing that.
In the interest of Jamf we have a lot of opportunities to build integrations with other reporting tools. So, I mean, you already saw our integration with Intune. ServiceNow. These are things that we want to get better at. So if you've got something in mind, I'd love to see a feature request. Thanks.
I'm actually building on top of that because we got a new security director who's a little more on the kind of corporate traditional side where it's just give me that report showing that we're compliant with everything. And kind of to the point of APIs, like they're great, but most there's no really good, amazing JSON XML parsers, or you have to use crazy Python to convert it into a CSV. And then kind of on top of the topic of Jamf, and it's like, Tableau, Splunk, ServiceNow, that's like Jamf, and that just killed my budget for the year because some of them can be pretty pricey. Have you guys seen anything like a secure, not necessarily open source, like JSON XML parser that could kind of leverage that report? And as a bonus question, can any of them be automated for kind of monthly reporting as well?
Well, lucky for you, OS 10 has a really great built-in tool called XML lint. And with some clever Bash or Python scripting, you can automate.
There's also one additional point that I'll put out there. The Jamf Marketplace, even though it's very new, we've been sifting through those vendors for actually quite a few weeks and months. And so much to the credit of Charles Edge, he's found a couple that actually has some great parsing tools on it. And one that I was just talking to, which I guess he'll be pretty happy that I'm going to mention him, but Command Security is one that has built a really good tool set of parsing that data, authentication attempts, the use of Eggshell and any type of SSH daemon concerns and issues. He's built a great integration that parses into Splunk and Tableau and all these other ones with JSON responses and reviews. And so that's just one example of the Jamf, and not the big stuff like ServiceNow and everything else that costs a lot of money, but also making sure that you get those logs that you're going to need, and from an audit perspective, you need to have access to them. So that's where I would say Marketplace, and try to review some of those vendors.
Are there usually prices associated with the Marketplace stuff?
We don't have them publicly placed on our Marketplace, so certainly click through and find what those prices are.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
We have just a couple more minutes, so I guess one more question, please.
Yeah, to add on that, go on the Marketplace and check out Central, which does that. It's open source, it's free. Try it out. It's going into that way. And my question is, most of the compliance-related checkings rely on building extension attributes. And by that, I think they usually run only once a day when you do inventory. And so you need to balance out the whole thing about, you want to have the compliance reporting on a more timely manner. And on the other hand, you can't just run inventory every 15 minutes for a large fleet of computers. So what do you think about how to balance that, or what to do about that?
I'll do one quick response before handing it over to Miles. In the government space, the 1 hour mark has been a good standard that most of the agencies use. So that's what I know from that perspective.
So for the how, that's a little too deep for right now, but what you can do is, if you're collecting a particular extension attribute, you can build perhaps a launch daemon to go along with that will detect the change that you're looking for, and then submit a partial inventory, or maybe even just that extension attribute. So that's something to talk to Jamf about how you make that happen, but that is a capability.
Okay, thanks.
Or an event that triggers a policy that triggers an inventory.
Okay. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to say a profound thank you to Luis, Miles, Matt, Kane, and Andrew. Thank you all for coming, friends and also sponsors. They're downstairs in the exhibit hall. Thank you all for participating and asking really great questions. Our next session in this room is at 11:30 a.m., and that is from minutes to seconds, rapid iOS redeployment at Eventbrite. Thank you all. Really appreciate your time.